Hi, my name is Ted Maselesele. I'm a credit rating analyst at Sovereign Africa Ratings. I'm joined by a fellow analyst, Temba Ndimande, to discuss the hot button topic of US tariffs. On the 2nd of April 2025, US President Donald Trump announced a two-tier system of tariffs to be charged on every country. The first being a 10% baseline tariff, and the second being reciprocal tariffs to be charged. The US's rationale for this was to correct trade imbalances, bring back American jobs, and bring back manufacturing to America. Mr. Begi, can you shed some light on the global impact and reactions we've seen?
Okay, Ted, thank you so much for this. Yes, as we know that these reciprocal tariffs have since been postponed for 90 days. But before we got there, we saw that the market reacted in a negative way. We saw that almost 6 trillion was wiped out in a single day or in a couple of days from the US markets. And we saw that the global markets were actually going down in a way that was so scary for everyone in the world. But what we've seen so far is that most countries have not retaliated, except for China. They have decided to take a pause, a wait and see attitude to see what's going to happen after these 90 days. But China is retaliated. I think at the moment, as we're speaking now, their reciprocal tariffs also have gone as high as 124%, if I'm not mistaken, is something along those lines. But we have also seen non-tariff restrictions that China has put in the US economy. They've restricted the import of beef and other products. And as we're speaking today, I saw that they've ordered their airline carriers not to take delivery of Boeing. So it's something that is affecting everyone. If you can take us to the effects maybe in the African context, what is it that African economies can do?
From an African context, it's very unique when you look at it from a country-to-country basis. There are some winners and there are some losers. For example, when you look at the apparel and textiles industry, Bangladesh and Vietnam have been hit with reciprocal tariffs, where you find countries like Kenya that have only been hit with the 10% baseline. So that makes them much more competitive in a global context. Compounded also by restrictions in AGOA, the expected benefit has been reduced slightly. You also have some very big losers, unfortunately, like South Africa, who have been hit hard by reciprocal tariffs, US aid cuts, as well as the issues with AGOA. Some threats maybe that I've came across in an African context is the restrictions in trade will make it much more harder for export reliant countries to enter the global market. Imports have become much more expensive, which will make life expensive for African countries and citizens. And then the biggest one is that a lot of African countries are exposed to the US and Chinese markets. So they will find themselves stuck in the middle of a trade war if that were an eventuality.
Okay, a good example, Ted, is our neighbor Lesotho. You know, with about 327 million US dollars exports to the US in textiles, like their Levi's jeans going to the US, that's about 12,000 jobs that are potentially going to be lost. I think that is one threat that we can look at and say it's something that needs to be done. Something definitely needs to be done to try and correct this. I was thinking that is there anything that you think African governments can do? We have seen the EU, a bloc of 27 countries now coming together. They have a stronger voice because they are stronger together. What can African countries do maybe to try and mitigate this threat of the global tariffs that the US is imposing on other countries?
I think the big touching point that stands out to me is that this has incentivized a lot of African countries to start thinking about the need for intracontinental trade. Agencies such as the African Continental Free Trade Area will definitely boost trade between African countries, especially if zero tariffs are charged between the two. But another opportunity that arises is that we, as Africans now, can become key contributors or suppliers to countries that have been hit with heavy tariffs and cannot trade with the US or Chinese anymore.
Okay, right. Because I saw the point. The point that you're making, the President Cyril Ramaphosa making a similar point that it's time for African countries now to strengthen trade relations amongst themselves. Because you can see that they're saying trade within the African continent is less than 10%, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, less than 10%. Imagine if we were to grow it to maybe 30% or even 50%. I think the European Union trade amongst those countries is close to 60%.
You make some very compelling points, Mr. Beki. Just looking at the trends going forward, what sort of manifestations do you see in the short and medium term regarding these tariffs?
I'm thinking that if these tariffs don't are not rescinded, or if the 90 days comes and you find that there are no agreements, or there are not trade agreements between the US and its allies or in its trade partners, we might actually see a hit in the global economy. People are already talking of a recession for the world economy, and especially for the US economy. So it might actually be worse than, there are even talks of something worse than a recession, maybe a depression. So it's something that the US needs to think about, because in the short term, you can see that inflation is going to go up. That's why we're beginning to see these concessions. President Trump seeming to be softening his stance, because I heard him now talking about thinking of actually easing restrictions on automobiles, on cars, and so on, because they can see that it's going to affect not only the countries that he's targeting, but also US citizens.
It's a very good point that you bring up, Mr. Beki, as for example, with South Africa, the automotive industry is a very large one. It employs a lot of people. And with the restrictions in AGOA and again, the tariffs that have been charged or imposed on South Africa, it will make it very difficult to, for example, drop our unemployment rate or boost economic development within the country.
Yes, it's true. Not only the auto industry, but also look at the farmers, the citrus fruits that are going to the US. And also, South Africa is the most industrialized economy in Africa, is exposed. I think it's 14.7 billion exports in 2024 that went to the US. So you can see that we have a lot to lose if something is not done to rectify this current situation.
And then another thread that I had noted in my research, Mr. Beki, was the rise of protectionism in terms of non-trade barriers such as trade restrictions, anti-dumping laws, especially around China. What light can you shed on those sort of developments?
I'm seeing European countries especially having fears that if the US market is closed for Chinese goods, where do you think all these goods are going to go? Obviously, they will be dumped either in Europe, in Africa. So whilst they are rooting, European countries are actually rooting that the US and China fix their trade war, if I may call it that, so that at least Chinese products don't end up in European countries, being dumped in European countries, and then affecting manufacturing in those countries. But one also has to look at how serious this is. We have seen the Chinese president for quite a long time. I think yesterday he was in Vietnam. He's going to Cambodia and also Malaysia. He's not been in Malaysia, I think they're saying, since 2012. So it's showing you that this is something that the Chinese are not taking lightly. They are trying to form alliances. Whilst the US is on the other side negotiating, giving themselves these 90 days to negotiate trade deals with all these countries, China is not seated idle. The Chinese president is moving around, also trying to form alliances of their own. I think there is a summit in July with the European Union, so it's something they're not taking lightly. And they have these other tools as well that they can use to fight the US, like these, as we say, these non-tariff options that they have. Like we talked about banning exports of US agricultural products. We also talked about Boeing now airlines in China being discouraged from taking, orders from Boeing. But there are others as well. If you note, China is the second largest holder of US bonds after Japan. So there are still these options that are at play. So we're watching to see what's going to happen. I think everyone is keen to see how this goes. We hope for a quick resolution, but we have 90 days, let me say, to see how it all pans out.
You bring up a very compelling point about the uncertainty that is still around globally based on whether or not Trump will impose the reciprocal tariffs or after negotiation if they will go down. A lot of countries don't know whether Trump will impose the reciprocal tariffs or not. And based on our scenario modeling, this uncertainty leads us down two roads. One where the escalation continues and there is a downturn in global markets. We do see some form of recession or depression, and there is an escalation between the US and Chinese trade wars. The other arm of the leg is the de-escalation, whereby we are able to find some sort of resolution, especially between the developed markets, such as the EU and the Americas, where they do find common ground, and we can continue things as they've normally been. I don't know how. Okay. I can't go political now.
I think one thing that we can take away from all this trade is that things will never be the same again, especially when you're looking at the US economy. People used to think, or we used to know that the US economy or the US markets were considered as very stable. But with this uncertainty that you are talking about, this is why we were seeing the dollar losing value and the bond yields, spiking, because people have lost, seems like investors have lost confidence in the US markets. So the quicker this is resolved, maybe the better for the US and the better for the world. We say that if the US catches the flu, the whole world catches the flu. So yeah, we need to look at this with keen eyes. We'll see how it goes.
Thank you, Mr. Biggie, for joining me in this discussion. For those that want more information on how to get into contact with us or would like to view some of our reports and economic nuggets, you can follow the link down below or go to saratings.com. Thank you.